So today I'm going to be taking a look at one of the newest watches by Christopher Ward, which is their 12. This is their integrated sports watch. It's a release I didn't expect from Christopher Ward. I don't think most people were expecting it. Definitely took the watch nerdom by storm a little bit, and I think for fairly good reason. So yeah, let's get into the review and take a closer look. So we have a diameter of about 40, lug to lug with the end links of 50.7, without closer to 40 millimeters, height of just 10.4, and the lugs are around 24.5 millimeters around the case. Some other general specifications for this watch, we're going to have the Sellita SW200 movement beating away in here. You can see through the sapphire case back. This is also a watch that has 100 meters of state of water resistance with a screw down crown, which is nice to see. Christopher Ward does use X1 Superluminova for all the hands and the indices. We have a sapphire crystal on the front. They do claim they use an air coating. They don't state whether it's on the inside or the outside, so take that for what it is. Sapphire crystal on the case back, of course, as well. And last but not least, this watch retails, at least on the bracelet, for $1,225 US, at least given current exchange rates and whatnot. I believe on rubber strap, this comes in at about like $990, just under $1,000. Just to state, I did pay for this in the US and I had it shipped, so I had to pay closer to $1,400 with import fees and all that good stuff. So it is a little bit pricier on bracelet, but I think pretty good value still. So starting off with the dial of this watch, and I think interestingly, this is probably one of the more important points of design for this watch. They went with a dial pattern, a dial design, a dial texture that's not only never been used before, but is now very unique to Christopher Ward because it incorporates their twin flag logo. You'll see it a little bit more as we zoom in, but each one of those little markers, each one of those little boxes on the dial are the kind of cross logo of the Christopher Ward logo. And it actually comes together very nicely on the dial. It's three-dimensional. It isn't super flat. It has a good amount of depth to it. So although it's not, I guess you can say, overly changing as you move it side to side, just because it doesn't have a lot of differentiating parts of the dial design. It's very uniform, it's very consistent, and there's not any anglage or angles or difference in finishing among the different levels. That being said, it still is a fairly interesting pattern because it does rise off the dial a good amount, and there is just that very slight shift you get between the, I guess you can say, angles of the squares in a sense. Looking a little bit more generally, we do have, of course, at least with this version, a nice kind of gray charcoal dial, which I really like. It gives this cool monotone look to the entire watch. Of course, with the more classic stainless steel bright silver of the bracelet and the case, and this darker charcoal of the dial, I think it just pairs really well. We do have these triangular markers for the indices with a double marker at 12, a half marker at 6, because we have that date window there. Very nicely aligned, and I like how they did that to keep the symmetry. You also have these triangular styled hands. I don't really think I've seen this style of handset before, so I don't know quite what I would call them. It is kind of like a modified dolphin hand or a modified, I don't even know. It's a modified Christopher Ward handset now, I guess you can say. One nice aspect is you do have a lot of differences in finishing on the dial alone. You do have brushed and polished surfaces on the indices, on the hands, and it is just nice to see because it does catch the light really well. It feels premium because of how it sparkles and shines at you and plays as you move it around, and I just do think they did a pretty good job here. One thing I will note is they did this, what they're kind of moving forward with the Christopher Ward twin flag logo as just the only logo denoting their watch. To me, I don't love the way it looks on this dial. You have, of course, the text here that says automatic, and I think it would have been more balanced if it just said Christopher Ward at the top here. The logo itself, you can see at some angles, it kind of just blends away. It becomes blackened. It becomes one with the dial. And I think maybe it would be less so on different colors of dial, but at least on this gray version, it kind of disappears. And to me, cheapens the entire design a little bit. It just... it doesn't feel as premium to me. There's not very many brands I can think of that use only a logo for their watch. And I think that's for good reason. I think there's a classiness to using a name. There's a elegance. There's also just a symmetry aspect when you have other text on the dial with using a name rather than using a logo. So I do think if Christopher Ward changed that logo, it would feel a little bit more premium than it does now, but this is what we're left with. One thing I really like about this dial is really how much depth there is. This is only about a 10 millimeter watch, but you have height to the indices. You have this tiny little seconds track on the outside that's actually raised above the base dial. You of course have the actual texture to the dial texture itself, or not texture, but the depth to the dial texture itself rather. And it is just all coming together to create a unique dial and a surprisingly well-made dial for, I think, the price point. It's not very often we see processes like this done at this price. And the way that Christopher Ward claims that they're making this watch isn't too dissimilar to how Grand Seiko makes their dials. They're using a stamping process where they're using a mold, then stamping that with a couple 100 tons of force into the dial, or at least dial plate, to make this pattern. And then at least for this gray dial version, they're then electroplating it to get its exact color. So it's a very similar process to what Grand Seiko is doing, and then those watches are a couple $1,000s more. So it's nice to see Christopher Ward taking those steps and creating a product to this level. And before moving on to the macro footage, I just really like how they kept the text very minimal here. To be fair, no text at the 12, it is just the logo, and then we have automatic here at the 6, and then Swiss made at the very, very bottom. Something they do kind of pride themselves on is the fact that they didn't have to create a separate layer platform into the dial to add these text places. They actually just incorporated it into the texture, and it's well done. There's a thickness to the actual printing, and we'll see that in a second. So taking a look in natural light, you can see the gray basically just becomes a little bit lighter. You get an almost very subtle sunburst pattern that comes out, but it really isn't that sunbursty. Still looks good. You can see a little bit different aspects of the pattern at more extreme angles. It does change color more. In the shade, it basically just becomes that very monotone, dark charcoal gray. Doesn't change much at all, and it looks good. You can kind of see here on the wrist, even in direct sunlight, that bracelet still has a lot of shine, a lot of sparkle, a lot of attention being drawn to it. And it really does look good, even in very harsh, very direct sunlight. Looking in more shaded light, it becomes a little softer, a little bit more polished and premium looking. It shines just a little bit better, and that's typically what you do see in these more shaded, kind of soft box type situations. The watch looks great, the dial texture really pops, the color saturation looks amazing. It is a pretty nice watch in daylight. So zooming in on the dial here, and you can just see how interesting this pattern is. It has this very like bolt head type industrial look, sheet metal type of feel to this dial. It isn't as classic guilloche looking. It isn't as prim and proper as something like these classic patterns that we're used to seeing on dials, or as elegant and classy as a Grand Seiko texture. It's something a little bit more brutalist, and I do think it pairs well with this integrated type design, and is commendable, I think, because again, Christopher Ward went out of the box here and created their own texture based off their own ideals and their own logos, and I think it's executed well. Taking a look at the side view, you can see how raised up each one of those logos are. You essentially have kind of a little rectangle, a little box that on each side that slopes up to a little rectangle in the middle, and it creates this pattern repeating throughout the dial. You do have the base dial texture that shines through the rest of this cross pattern, and I think it just looks really cool. There's a pretty uniform color to it, but because some of those boxes are sloped, they do catch the light a little bit differently than other angles. So depending on what kind of orientation you're having the watch in, it kind of switches what is lit and what isn't, and it's surprisingly lively. Looking at the markers here, and I am a little disappointed, it seems like the brushing is done pretty kind of, in my opinion, roughly. It's not done very precisely. It's not done very prim and proper to the way I usually expect Christopher Ward brushing is. Like if you look at the hands here, beautifully brushed, really nice, defined, and just no complaints about it. But if you look at the indice here, it looks like they decided to try to brush it and then they said, yeah, never mind. It's a very faint application, and I don't know if that's a stylistic choice or not, but to me it looks like it's just done incorrectly. You could say maybe this is an imperfection on a singular index, but as we look around, each one has the same kind of pattern on it. So it's one of those things where it's not consistent. It looks like it's supposed to be brushed on the top, but most of them aren't. So it is a little bit confusing because it disappears at certain angles, and to me it doesn't look very premium doing that. Digressing a little bit, you do see we have these sloped sides to the triangular marker. It looks really nice. The triangular sides are highly polished. They catch the light in a nice way depending on what angle you're holding it at. So that part of the index is really well done, and the lumen fill is really well done, and it actually sinks in a little bit lower than the rest of the metal applied elements do. So as a whole, I really do like how the marker is constructed and how it's finished despite this brushing part, which I think looks very, very, very subpar. Focusing on the hands for a second, we do not have the same issue as the indices. We can see that the brushing is very well defined, pretty nice, has this beautiful silver color to it that contrasts beautifully against the highly polished angles on the side, and the polish itself is done well. We can even look at the second's hand here and see it's really well polished along the base of it. So there isn't really any imperfection on this dial aside from the fact that, you know, these markers aren't done correctly in my opinion. Looking at the base of the minute hand, we see the same story, really well done, really well finished. So at least it's not something I've really noticed from wrist view with the indices, but the fact that 12 or, you know, more correctly 13 markers are done incorrectly and there's not many other applied elements on the dial is a little sucky. And then really quickly, just focusing on the Ward logo here. Well done, it is all fully brushed. I would have maybe preferred to see some polished accents, some unglaze, something just a little bit to make it look a little bit better, a little bit more poppy. But it is kind of just brutalist in the way that they executed it, which is, you know, okay. I do still just think it would look better as Christopher Ward written out, just how they did the automatic text down here, which is really well done. It has a bulbousness to it, it has three-dimensional quality to it, and it sits well on top of the actual pattern, which I don't find very often. Looking at the date window, we can see it's nicely framed, giving us a little pathway down to the actual date disc. The disc is also color matched the dial pretty perfectly. It's a nice kind of pebbled gray. Of course, not the same dial texture because that'd be a little overkill and probably impossible, but it blends in nicely. The white's very legible. It's easy to see. I've never had a problem seeing the actual date itself, but it also doesn't distract my eye from the dial. It's not only symmetrically aligned, but color-wise, it blends in very well. And then just as a last point of attention, we do have this beautiful seconds track or minutes track, whichever you prefer, along the outside, almost close to the bezel here. And you can see it's raised off a little bit from the dial. It gives a little bit more depth to the dial that otherwise wouldn't be there, and I think is a really nice important detail of the watch. It has this kind of somewhat brushed finish to it. So a lot of good parts and elements to this dial, but I do think a little bit of QC needs to be tightened up here and there. Focusing on the case of this watch, and I think this is what a lot of people are going crazy for. Christopher Ward made an integrated sports watch. It's fairly good looking, it's fairly unique, and it's really thin. It's executed really well. It's not something that's, you know, oh, what they had a really good design, but it's like 14 millimeters thick and it just wears like a brick on the wrist. No, it's elegant. There's some svelteness to this case, and it is actually a really well-wearing case. Digressing a little bit, we can see we have mainly brushed finishes here, all vertical brushing for the most part, a little bit of horizontal brushing on the case sides and on the case sides of the, or not case sides, but bracelet sides, I guess you can say, of the links. And it's well done. It's very fine brushing. To me, it looks pretty premium. Even this flat brushing on the top of the case here, really well done. Brushing on the very top of the bezel here, really nicely done, and integrates really well with just the look of everything. I'm glad they didn't go with a bunch of brushing directions and different angles and did circular brushing on the bezel and, you know, circular brushing on the case and other brushings here and there. It just flows very well. Design-wise, feels very cohesive. Now, the reason this model is called the 12 is because we have this 12-sided bezel, this dodecahedron, and, you know, it is cool, it is different, but I do think they went underboard with it in a sense. They didn't go as full out with the bezel as they should have. They could have made the dial a little bit smaller or maybe even the case a little bit bigger, but to me, this bezel deserves a little bit more real estate. It has this beautifully unique shape. It has a lot of difference of finishing to it. It has brushing on the top. It has polish in between. It has actually sandblasting in these little angles there. So these to me are all elements that tell you how well this is finished, how much attention to detail was paid to this design element of the bezel. But it's not something you really see. In my wearing experience, it kind of blends away and a lot of the times almost feels like a smooth bezel, which at times you see, oh, there's a slight bit of angularity to it, which to me is underwhelming. This is or should be at least, one of the main design features of this watch, and it's taking a back seat to almost everything else. Something I did want to focus on just for a second is really how well done this bezel is. You can see we have this very top flat portion, which is completely brushed. Then we move down into this actual pointed shaped portion of the bezel that is completely high polished. And we move into these little reliefs in between these pointed out jutted sections, which is actually blasted. So you have these three different finishes, and it's a shame because, again, I didn't even realize this blasted portion until looking at this super magnification. So it's one of those things where there's a lot of attention to this bezel. There's a lot of beauty, there's a lot of architecture, but it's just really not on full display. And I think that's a little bit of a shame. It does look really premium, and I think it deserves to be on display a little bit more. Looking at the case side for a second, we can see it is not really that thick at all. We have a decent protrusion in the case back, which tends to just wear into the wrist, a pretty thin svelte mid case, and then this bezel portion on the very top. So all this comes together to create a, give or take 10mm watch, which wears on the wrist really well. The integration kind of, in a sense, helps it wear even sleeker and is closer to the wrist. So I have no complaints. They did a really nice job with this case construction and this proportionality of it. And it's also nice that they have this angularity motif in the bezel that's actually mirrored in the case back, which is fun. You have these like square-ish, round-ish crown guards to me. I don't notice them overly. I do think it's nice to have them there. I could take them or leave them, but they're there and they're not bad. The crown is pleasurable to use. It unscrews very nicely. It winds, a little bit grainy, but that's to be expected for the SW. When you push it in, it screws in very nicely, so no complaints with the crown or the action of the movement overall. And moving on to this bracelet, and I do think they did an amazing job with the bracelet, not only because the brushing is done well and done finely and done to a pretty high standard, but I really love all the polish accents of this. Not only does this chamfered side of the bracelet flow perfectly into the chamfered side of the case and just follow along a perfect line into the other edge of the bracelet, it doesn't disappear, it doesn't lose its strength, it doesn't lose its tension. But I just, again, think it's beautifully done. It accents the brushing and just draws your eye into a really important feature of the watch. And not only do you have the outside polishing on both sides of the bracelet, but you do have the inside polishing on each link. So as you're kind of wearing the watch, as you're moving it, as you're moving your wrist, it does light up beautifully and just have this light play that I think is really unexpected at this price point. They did a really good job on this bracelet. One thing to note, and I'm hoping my zoom in helps a little bit here, you can see here at that connecting link, and this is a very, very minor issue, but there's a little bit of like warpiness / scratchiness to that inside link. And the reasoning I'm thinking is the fact that the polish section of this link and the brush section just aren't meeting cleanly enough. There's a little bit of a mismatch there. So this bracelet does have an effect of, it's kind of at the consequence of its own, high finishing standards. You have those very small QC issues. They do stand out a little bit, or at least they stand out to me as a wearer. It's something you can easily forget about and not focus on, but it's there. And maybe will be there on a model you pick up. One thing too is they do have a quick release system for this watch. They do have integrated rubber straps that do go with the watch, and I was supposed to have one here for a review, but it got delayed by over a month, so I was like, well, I'll just do it when my titanium version comes in and show it on that strap then. But, I do think the integrated rubber option looks really nice. I'm not usually the hugest fan of integrated rubber options because of how they do it. To me is a little bit brash, a little bit, not as aesthetically pleasing as I'd want it to, but I think Christopher Ward did a good job, and hopefully it looks good in person. Really quickly touching on the clasps, Christopher Ward did go for a butterfly deployment system. I'm not the biggest fan of butterfly deployments because typically they hurt, to be frank. They don't sit overly comfortable on the wrist. Typically brands don't go for different sized links, so they don't go for any micro adjust systems, so it either fits you or doesn't. What is nice is Christopher Ward did include maybe possibly a 3/4 and a full 4th link. So at least they do have different size links. It just is one of the facts that, at the end of the day, it doesn't have a micro adjust. The clasp itself has some sharper edges here, like on the inside of the actual clasp mechanism. So if you wear the watch too tight or you flex your wrist at a certain angle, it can hurt. It can be an uncomfortable wearing experience. So that's something to keep in mind. The actual edges of like the bracelet are really soft and really comfortable, and it's not as sharp as something like, let's say, a Royal Oak, which can be very uncomfortable. So that is nice to see. But the bracelet, I think, can use a little bit of softening or just use a different clasp. We do have screw links, which is nice. And before I move on to how it wears, I just want to appreciate this link style. We have this like beautiful fat wide style link, I guess you can say. And I do think it just looks really good, has a beautiful taper to it. And really interestingly enough, I think this is one of those few integrated bracelets that actually wears smaller than you would expect it to, because it's much thinner here at the bracelet end than you typically see. Usually you get like a fattish case with equally fat bracelet, and that tapers off only towards the end. But this tapers off almost immediately and to good effect, to where this feels like a 40mm watch and maybe even slightly smaller at some points. Focusing a second on the case back, of course we're not doing any hot horology movement, finishing, or anything like that. We do have a nice customized rotor. The Christopher Ward in white against that black background looks pretty premium, and just some general text on the outside. So nothing to write home about, but again, I do really like how that dodecahedron motif is complemented in the case back like it is on the bezel. So there was attention to detail paid here, and I do like that. So moving on to how this watch wears, earlier I was wearing this 36mm Timex Q, so it kind of gives you an idea of like a smaller integrated bracelet look. And here we have the watch sitting on my 6.5-inch wrist, and you can see for a 40mm it fits perfectly. It doesn't overhang the edge of my wrist, it doesn't look too fat, it doesn't look like a watch that's a bracelet first and a watch second. It's very much a watch that has a complementary bracelet. And I really like Christopher Ward doing this. It's one of the very few integrated watches where I go, this fits amazingly. I don't need a smaller size. I think the fact that they're coming out with the 36mm later will fit also awesomely. But like, let's say if I compare it to a Royal Oak, the 40 I don't really like the size of. I like the 37mm. So this being a 40 that I actually really like how it sits, how it fits on wrist, is awesome. The links are fairly small. The case itself is fairly small, so it sits really nice and snug and close to the wrist surface. It is a comfortable watch, at least from the top view. It does kind of, again, dig here on the clasp because it's a butterfly to point, which has some sharper angles, which to be fair, I don't think should be there. Looking at it from more of a side view, you can see even though it doesn't have a curved mid case, because that case back sits pretty much into the wrist, it sits really well onto the wrist. It's not overly bulky. It doesn't rise up at all any more than you would expect it to. There's no sharp angles on the case itself, so it doesn't hurt or pinch or grab, especially even the bracelet. It doesn't really pinch hairs, it doesn't grab hairs, which is really nice to see. So this is a pretty comfortable watch to wear on wrist. I have no complaints with it other than the butterfly deploying clasp, and if you like the look of it, you're probably going to really like it in person. So taking a look at the Lume here, we see we do have this very classic X1 type glow to the Lume itself. It has this bluish leaning tint to it, not quite as green as C3 Superluminova. So it's pleasurable to see. I do think they did a decent application. The hands, the indices, they all match color tone wise pretty perfectly. There isn't any spot that's brighter than the other, so the Lume is applied evenly. I will say there's not as much Lume as applied as I thought there would be. It doesn't shine overly brightly. It's not a torch. It's not something that lasts overly long. So I do think they could have maybe improved that Lume application a little bit more, maybe made it a little bit more three-dimensional, put some more layers in there. Wouldn't have hurt to see. Reluming and comparing to my classic Timex Snoopy, you can see between the two they have a similar color tone temperature. The initial brightness is fairly similar. So again, the Christopher Ward didn't do a bad job overall. I just do think they could do a better job, include a little bit more Lume, because as it stands, it does die off a little quicker than I expected it to. So pros and cons of this watch, and I think one of the biggest pros off the bat is just how it wears. They did a really good job on the thinness of the watch. They did a really good job on the comfortability. It isn't too sharp at most places on the watch. It feels good on wrist. It drapes well. It does fit me fairly well. And again, it just is a pleasurable wearing experience. It wears a lot better than a 40mm integrated bracelet usually does. Like if you're comparing this to, let's say, the Timex PRX, at 40mm, I personally think it's a little bit too big for my wrist, and I prefer the 35. At 40, I'm completely fine, and I'm completely okay with how this watch wears. So it's one of those ones where they did a really good job on the bracelet, the taper of it, just the way it integrates to the case, and it is just a pleasurable watch to wear. The next pro is going to be the finish of the watch. They did a great job. The brushing is very fine, it's uniform, it really catches the light, similarly to a Royal Oak, not quite the same. To be fair, it's probably more realistic to compare it to the Tissot PRX. So it has that effect. That brushing really catches the light, almost like how a polish would, but in a little bit more of a subtle way. You have these beautiful polish accents that break up that brushing and make it feel a little bit more premium and less just like of a utility watch. They did accent the polishing pretty perfectly on this watch, in my opinion. I don't think they went overboard. They didn't do too much. It still looks sporty. It doesn't look too dressy, but it looks just right, and I commend them on that. Another aspect of this watch that I really like is the fact that they did a really good job on the dial texture. Obviously, they integrated their Christopher Ward flag logo into the dial and basically made a new dial texture, a new dial pattern. And it, in my opinion, looks really good. It's not a traditional guilloche that we're used to seeing, and what I really like about it is most guilloches, or like even if you look at the pattern that the Royal Oak typically uses, that tapisserie pattern, it's very fine. There's obviously, quote unquote devil in the details. There's a lot of attention paid to that detail, and it's done very well on a micro level. But I like designs like this that give you just a little bit more out the gate, a little bit more in your face, a little bit more frontward in terms of like presentability. It shows you what it's doing more easily. You don't have to kind of get a loop and focus on it, which, although if you do, it still looks pretty cool. But because the three-dimensionality that this dial texture has built in, because it's a fairly larger texture, as you move it around, it's not like you completely see like, oh my God, it's amazing, mind-blowing, like let's say some more defined Grand Seiko-ish type textures. But you can tell that there's attention paid here, there's a unique texture, it's done well, and it's something that, again, you can kind of just see with the naked eye, which is nice. Last but not least, I do think that they came in with a pretty good price. You get a decent movement, you got good finishing, you have a well-integrated bracelet and case construction, thinness. All this comes together at around $1,200 retail. Now, I'm in the US, I had to pay import fees, taxes, so I was closer to about $1,450 after all is said and done. And to be fair, I think for that price, it's still a very good watch. You're getting decent value. You're getting an integrated watch where there aren't many in the watch industry. Again, the PRX is kind of one of the only bastions that exist right now at the more affordable range. And I think it is a fair step up. It feels a little bit more premium. It's a little bit more well executed. So if you always wanted an integrated sports watch, you always wanted that look, that feel, that box checked in your collection, this is a good option. So moving on to cons, and there are a few in my opinion. One of the biggest ones, especially for me, that I've experienced the most and that I think I should point out the most, is the fact that the clasp is not comfortable. I typically hate butterfly clasps on pretty much any watch. I hate it on Royal Oaks, I hate it on Pateks, I hate it on everything. And I just don't like butterfly deployments. I feel like typically they tend to be sharp, they tend to not sit well on the wrist, and although it's cool, it has this like integrated bracelet look, I don't think that's a worthy sacrifice in a sense. It's very rarely executed well enough to where, at least on my wrist, like how I would like to wear watches, it feels comfortable. And this is the same. It looks nice, it's well integrated, but parts of the bracelet are a little bit sharp, and depending on how tight I wear my watch or the way I flex my wrist or something like that, it digs and it hurts, and it's not a comfortable wearing experience. The rest of the watch is very comfortable. The bracelet's silky, the case isn't sharp, but the clasp lets it down, and it makes the wearing experience a little lesser and a little bit more refined than the rest of the watch, which I don't think this watch deserves in a sense. I think you should have just gone for a bigger clasp, add some micro adjust to the clasp. Christopher Ward has a micro adjust system. All these tiny little aspects, in my opinion, would have done plenty to make the watch better and kind of fixed a lot of the issues that it has. And then my next couple cons are really just gonna be about the design of the watch. The first for me, and kind of the biggest, is the fact that I think they went a little bit too light on the bezel in a sense. They made it too small. It's not impactful enough. It has so much angularity, it has so much detail that I think if they would have made it a little bit larger, you would have appreciated it more. The bezel is absolutely beautifully done. It has so many angles, it has that mix of finishing, and when it catches your eye perfectly and at the right angle, it looks amazing. But I think had they made it larger, you would have seen more of that detail, you would have seen more of the finishing, you would have appreciated the bezel and the work that went into it a lot more. As it stands now, it kind of just like blends away into the watch design, and it's really not a forefront in your mind when you look at it, and I think it should be. An integrated sports watch, or at least most of the ones we know, have a pretty defined bezel or have a large bezel that draws your eye in. So with this, they kind of went all out on the design, and then they kind of brought it back 50%. They said, let's not focus on the bezel too much, even though we put all this effort into it. So it's a kind of a confusing part about the design for me. I think it would look good with a larger bezel, and I still think they should make that change. And lastly, the biggest con for me, keeping me from even wanting to consider keeping this watch, is I don't like the shape of the indices. They have this odd triangular shape to them, which I just don't think meshes well with the watch design. It looks a little bit at odds. I don't like how the triangular has this kind of rounded-ish tip to it. I don't like how little the lumen fill goes into the indice. It makes it look a little awkward in my opinion. And you don't have any really triangular design ideas, at least to me, on the face of the watch overly. or not the face of the watch, but on the design of the watch case. So I think a possibly more rectangular feeling, even rhombus shaped, more just squared off look to a marker would have looked better. I just do think that this is a little bit too odd of a marker. I think they try to do something different. They take a little bit of inspiration, in my opinion, from that Chapek Antarctique dial layout. It's a very similar dial index, but the Chapek does it better. It's more homogeneous with the design. It's more well executed. It's smaller. The lumen field goes further in. It's like the Christopher Ward took some of the aspects of it and they just made it that little bit worse, which, you know, sucks to say, but that's how I feel about it. There's something about that dial design, you know, especially because you have that Christopher Ward twin flag logo. You have that twin flag, guilloche effect on the dial. And the indices are just so at odds with that more rectangular, more geometric dial design. Maybe they did it for legibility purposes, that it has more contrast, it's a more different shape than what's on the rest of the dial, but I just don't think it blends well enough. Or they could have done it just a little bit better, really. So that's my opinion. Maybe you love the way the dial design looks, you like the markers, and if you do, this is a fantastic watch. But for me, this is an aspect of the design that I think hinders it a little bit, and with the rest of my cons, makes it a watch that I don't want. So final thoughts on this Ward here, and I think it's a fantastic watch. It's really well made. It's built to a pretty good standard. I think it comes in at a great price point. It just isn't all there for me. I do think if you want this integrated look, the PRX actually does it better in many ways. If you want a 40 millimeter, to be fair, if you have a smaller wrist, go for the 35 and it fits perfectly for the PRX. If you want a 40 millimeter and you have a small wrist, you know, this does fit better, but you gotta like the design. And I personally, it doesn't mesh well with me. To be fair, I'm not the biggest integrated sports watch fan. I don't overly like the Royal Oak. I don't overly like the Nautilus. I don't even really like the Chapek. And you know, that's something you should take into consideration. Maybe this isn't just, maybe this just isn't my segment of watches. Maybe this just isn't built for me. But with that being said, I can still appreciate good design. I love the way the Royal Oak looks. I just usually don't like how it wears on my wrist. So it's one of those things where I like the way this wears. I just don't like the way it looks. And that's really almost purely down to the bezel design and the markers. I think if they tweaked those, they changed those, they integrated, or not integrated, but iterated on those, they could have a really interesting, amazing piece of their catalog with this watch. It's a great first design. It's a great, first try in a sense. And I do think a lot of people will still like it. But I do think it could be better. It's my opinion. Anyway, those are just my thoughts. Let me know what you think. Let me know if I'm just completely wrong on everything. If I'm not, if you agree, if you disagree. Look forward to hearing from you, whatever you have to say, good or bad. Thank you as always for watching the video. Hope you got something out of it, and I'll see you in another one.